All right, welcome to my live. Thank you for subscribing to the My History Verified channel, and thank you for returning or leaving feedback in the comment section, even if it is nasty or not. Remember that the author of this reading material has left behind many gems for you to research further. So, I hope you are doing just that. Of course, individual research. I also have found out that I have some young listeners based on my statistics, and a follower who has let me know that her teenage child watches me and is utilizing the information as a learning tool. So I hope that I can improve on my research and what I present to you so that you can grow and be able to teach the same type of content to your children and to your friends, and for the edification of our community. Now, if you are new to the channel, thank you for joining us today. Please subscribe after viewing this episode, and thank you all for viewing the My History Verified channel. Now, you already know I'm your quirky ASF hood genealogist. Please say it with me. You already know what you got to say. I do not need permission to study my ancestry or the history of this world. Now, don't look for a certification, because what? There will be not one display on my channel while on this journey. Now, I can get certifications, and I have certifications, but for the purpose of my genealogy and ancestry, I just want to encourage others that you don't need no certification, because you're researching, and as you go, you're learning, and you're learning things. If you can read and you can write, you can interpret it and analyze documents and papers, then you are doing yourself justice. Now, go ahead and take this journey with me. Now, welcome back. You already know that I need to tell you where we are at with this reading. We have completed the chapters of book 1, meaning all of the chapters, and now we are currently about to read book 2, chapters 1 and 2. Thank you for being on this awesome learning journey with me that will not only lead us to names, people, and places, but it will also support us in the comprehension of the terminology and tasks your genealogy and ancestry research often runs into. While doing so, we must also recognize the laws, events, and occurrences of race and ethnicity that always seems to coincide with each other. And we know that both race and ethnicity led to outcomes of devastating constraints, and they also, in one way or another, shaped the lives of our ancestors with a stroke of a pen. We will continue our journey of the reading of this book, where the author discusses the differences between the Mexican Aborigines and the South and Northeast Coast Aborigines, pointing out the religious worship practices and the rituals of the Mexican Aborigines' worship of their sun god and the demon of blood, which was the sacrifice of their own children. All of this is from the book titled The History of Ancient America, Anterior to the Time of Columbus, proving the identity of the Aborigines with the Tyrians and Israelites. This great book is authored by George Jones, written between the dates of 1810 and 1879. Please take the time to view my past video, the reclassification of the North and Southeast Coast Amerindian, taped as a live stream because it is the beginning read for the chapters already read. I hope that you follow along with me using this credible source located via the Library of Congress, because it will help you to conceptualize the harm many of the people of the past placed upon the original land dwellers based on race and ethnicity. Then, by applying a pen stroke and their biases that seem to always turn into laws. And those laws governed the land masses and the power and ultimately the control over the descendants of the original North and Southeast Coast Aborigines today. I will continue to use this book reading to interpret what the author wanted the King of Prussia to know of his findings, even though he clearly did so in paragraph 1, which consists of nearly 20 plus pages of its 492 pages. It is a valuable read for all, especially the descendants of the Aborigines, the reclassified African American today. Let us continue our edification of this powerful linguistics of the truth of a people, by and large, who have not yet figured out who they are or just need reminder and validation of their feelings and knowledge that so often gets swept under the rug for subject matter silence. Let's go ahead and move forward. Epoch, the first book, the second, the Tyrian era, on the founding of ancient America continued and historically established as being in the year 332 before Christ. Door ratio, O day and night, but this is wondrous strange. Hamlet. And therefore, as a stranger, give it welcome. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in our philosophy. Shakespeare. Ancient America, Book the Second, the scriptural, political, and commercial history of the Phoenician nations, but especially of the kingdoms of Tyrus and the migration of the Western Hemisphere. Chapter 1, 2349 through 1600 BC. The nations of Phoenicia, 2349 before Christ. In reviewing the history of the great Phoenician family, an interest of a strong and peculiar character is now given to it from the new and apparent fact that the nations of that family were not annihilated in its literal sense by the Babylonian, Macedonian, or the Roman at the great capitals Sidon, Tyrus, and Carthage. The Phoenicians as a people will now possess an interest in the mind of the English and American reader and all Europe of no common character, for all time forward the history of Tyrus and of Israel must be regarded as being blended with that of the Western Hemisphere, and as a consequence with the Anglo Saxon race, whose colossal tread, ere a century shall have passed, will obliterate every minor footprint on the western continent. For the institutions of Alfred and of Washington, freedom founded tower like sheltering palm trees over the desert sands of the previous nations. The Phoenicians claim with absolute certainty the most remote antiquity for the foundation of their house for as the history of nations requires no date and antecedent to that of the deluge, that of Phoenicia is traceable to that event, 2349 BC, and as a consequence, the first book of Moses is the fountain from which all the channels of certain and early knowledge are derived. From the sacred volume, we learn that the three and only sons of Noah were Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Ham is the father of Canaan. unquote. Japheth was the eldest, and from him is supposed to have descended the family of Europe. To Shem, the second son, is traceable the house of Israel, and to that august family was granted by the Almighty the sacred covenant, the holy laws, and the nativity of the blessed Savior. The family of the youngest son, Ham, is traceable with the same certainty as that of his next elder brother, while that of Japheth, the firstborn, is left in comparative obscurity. The branch of our history now before the reader contemplates the fate and family of the last son of Noah, and to those points only will continue now be directed, and at the conclusion the reader will not fail to observe that Noah's malediction upon the youngest offspring of his last child was not uttered by the insulted patriarch in vain. The cause of that curse is familiar to every reader, but for the argument to follow, it is necessary to bring it forward in this place. 2218 BC. And Noah began to be an husbandman, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and was drunken, and he was covered, and he was uncovered within his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, now and Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brethren without. And Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon both their shoulders, and went backward, and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were backward, and they saw not their father's nakedness. And Noah awake from his wine, and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. Genesis 9:20 through 27. The prophetical part of the above and its accomplishment will be proved in the last chapter of this volume, and in support of the present theory, the malediction will here be especially noticed as belonging to this history. It is singular that Noah's curse is not cast upon the son Ham, who foully wronged his person, but upon that son's youngest male child, viz., Canaan. Ham had four sons only, Shem 5, and Japheth 7. Quote, and the sons of Ham, Cush, and Mizraim, and Phut, and Canaan. Unquote. The cause why the curse was not bestowed upon all the children of Ham and their descendants may be as follows. This Noah's last grandson was Canaan, and being born in the very dotage of Noah, for he had no child of his own after the deluge, it is natural, therefore, that his youngest grandson, and which was the 16th, would be the object of his aged fondness, as Jacob loved Joseph, being, quote, the son of his old age, unquote, this must have been known to his sons and their children, and when his person was violated by his own and youngest son, the patriarch, to give greater power to his curse of indignation, cast it upon the dearest object of his doting love, reasoning thus, viz. Quote, my youngest son hath wronged me, therefore his youngest son shall suffer. Unquote. We do not say his youngest child, for there might have been a daughter, and the daughters of Noah, or those of his three sons, are not mentioned in the Bible. Although Noah's quote, wife unquote, and his sons quote, wives unquote, are. The same sacred historian has omitted any mention of the immediate daughters of Adam, and it is evident they must have been born before the births of Eve's third son, Seth. For, quote, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch, unquote. Now, the wife of Cain must have been his own sister, while the grandsons of Noah must have married their cousins or perhaps sisters. Some skeptical writers have believed that many, quote, Adams and Eves, unquote, were placed simultaneously in different parts of the globe. If not, they say, quote, they, people, must have married their sisters, unquote. If such disbelievers have traveled through even the paths of history, they would have found that such was actually the custom even after the deluge. Abram's wife, Sarah, was his own stepsister. It was practiced in Egypt and thought no crime, from the monarch to the peasant. But the progress of religion and civilization, with their attendant radiant blessings, dispelled the darkness and destroyed the degenerating custom. Intellect was, also, thereby rescued from gradual but certain decay, for experience has proved that the nearer the blood relationship of man and wife, the more distant are children of such marriages from intellectual or physical endowments. This slight digression is introduced merely to shew that Moses omitted in more than the instance of Eve previous to the birth of her third son to mention the birth of daughters. They are understood to have been born attendant upon nature like the bright beams from the sun, but the first historian was anxious only to record the sons, sons, of men as being the recognized founders of the several branches of the human family. However unjust must be viewed Noah's curse upon an innocent object, viz., his grandson Canaan, most truly and terribly has that malediction been accomplished. The Arabs at the present day have an ancient law, apparently founded upon the above, though in a reverse position, and partaking of a strong moral obligation, viz., if a descendant of, quote, Hagar's offspring, unquote, Ishmael, shall commit a murder among his own race, the father of the assassin is given to the executioner upon the ground of argument that the father had not educated his son correctly, for if he had, the child would not have committed the homicide. This law has a strong tendency to prevent crime, for the son would not only give his father to the sword and thus become a parricide, but worse, in the estimation of the Arabs, he would cast upon his sire's memory the lasting infamy of having neglected his own offspring. To prevent this hazard, the Spartan child was educated by the state. Noah's sentence upon his youngest grandson for the crime of that child's father has never been repeated from that day to the present period or embodied in a code of laws. Yet has that sentence been literally accomplished upon Canaan and his descendants. The scriptural reader may, however, believe that the principle of the above is again repeated in the Decalogue. It is true that a curse is there placed in contrast to a blessing, but with humility we submit that is upon a point of religious worship only. Quote, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, statue, or any likeness, or anything that is in heaven above, sun, moon, or stars, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them," in other words, idols, "nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me." In other words, worship other gods. "And shewing mercy unto thousands," in other words, of generations, "of them that love me and keep my commandments." Unquote. In other words, not to worship idols. Exodus 20. We believe that the above sentence concerns religious worship only, and not for any personal act, for that is covered by the after laws upon the same tablets, and in regard to the crime committed by the father of Canaan, it is especially alluded to in Leviticus 18 and 7. Of these sons of Ham, Cush, the eldest, was the father of Nimrod, the founder of the Babylonian and Assyrian families. The second son, Mizraim, was the founder of the Egyptian empire. Thence the ancient name of Mizraim being applied to that country. Phut, the third son, apparently died without issue. At least there is no scriptural record of his descendants, but as this would be very improbable in that early date, immediately following the deluge, we will venture the suggestion whether the third son was not the founder of the great African family known as Negroes. But this is the only race not defined, apparently, by Moses, and Phut is the only child of the quote, accursed unquote, branch of Noah's quote, house unquote, whose descendants are not mentioned. Canaan, the fourth and youngest son, was the founder of the Canaanites. Canaan had 11 children, all of whom, except one, established nations. From that quote, firstborn unquote, of Canaan sprung the great Phoenician family. For upon the authority of Justin, an earthquake compelled a portion of the family of Canaan to leave the country they had first settled in, and they took up their residence upon the border of the Assyrian lake, but which they afterwards vacated and journeyed to the seacoast. 2178 BC, where the leader of that portion, viz. Sidon, built a city bearing his name, and he thus became the founder of the great maritime nations of the Mediterranean. And being divided from their brethren, the Sidonians became a separate and independent people. 1689 BC, in the deathbed blessing of Jacob upon Zebulun, the country of Sidon is mentioned. Genesis 10, 19, and 13. Quote, Zebulun shall dwell at the haven of the sea, and he shall be for an haven of ships, and his border shall be unto Sidon. Unquote. 1451 BC, Moses wrote of them as a nation in more than one instance. Quote, and the border of the Canaanites was from Sidon as thou comest to Gerar unto Gaza. Unquote. Genesis 10 and 19. Quote, with footnotes, from the river of Arnon into Mount Hermon, which Hermon the Sidonians called Sirion, and the Amorites, Canaanites called it Shinir. Unquote. Deuteronomy 30. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Deuteronomy 3, 8, and 9. In the last quotation, the Sidonians are distinctly stated to be a separate nation from the other branches of the Canaanites. 1444 BC, Joshua also defines them to be so and a powerful one. Quote, and the Lord delivered them, the Canaanites, into the hand of Israel, who smote them and chased them unto greater Sidon. Unquote. And Joshua 11 and 8. The early character of national independence enjoyed by the Sidonians and the primitive character of justice among them may be gathered from the description of the people of Laish, who are compared to the Sidonians, and the military prowess of the latter people is also expressed. 1406 BC, quote, then the 5 men departed and came to Laish and saw the people that were therein, how they dwelt careless, after the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and secure, and there was no magistrate in the land. Footnote, that might put them to shame for anything, in other words, for crimes, and they were far from the Sidonians. The increase of crime in any nation is instantly ascertained by finding the ratio increase of lawyers and the purity of a people by their absence, as at Laish, of course having regard to the relative increase of population. The same argument will obtain in reference to the increase of physical disease by observing the ratio increase of the members of the medical profession, initials G, J for Greg Jones. And they were far from the Sidonians and had no business with any man. Unquote. Quote, and there was no deliverer, because it, Laish, was far from Sidon. Unquote. Judges 18, 7, and 28. In the course of time, there were 6 kingdoms or nations of Phoenicia, viz., Sidon, Tyrus, Eridanus, Berytus, Byblos, and Carthage. The inhabitants of the kingdoms in Asia bore one general name, Phoenicians, though each had its own name from its derivative as Sidonians, Tyrians, etc. The great nation in Africa was not included in the general appellation, but from its republican character possessed its own, viz. Carthaginians. That will conclude chapter 1, History of Tyrus, its rise and fall, and the migration of the Tyrians to the Western Hemisphere, chapter 2, 1600 through 1046 BC, the founding of Tyrus, early navigation of the Tyrians, founding of the monarchy, the first king of Tyrus. The nation of Sidon have increased in power and population, sent one of the Camdi with a colony to found Tyre. This was on the continent or main land of the Phoenician coast, 23 miles from Sidon and 80 from ancient Jebus, in other words, Jerusalem. The motherland at another period sent a second colony to aid the previous one, and from which blended circumstance is found in the Bible that Tyrus is called, quote, the daughter of Sidon, unquote. The year in which the first colony was sent is not defined, but it must have been many years before the conquest of the Canaanites by Joshua. For not only were there in existence at that time the quote, great Sidon, unquote, but in dividing the subdued lands among the tribes, that of Asher received certain portions of the seacoast of Phoenicia, and it is distinctly stated that Tyrus at that period was a metropolis and fortified. Quote, and Hebron, and Rehob, and Hammon, and Cana, even unto great Sidon, and then the coast turneth to Ramah, and to the strong city Tyre, unquote. Joshua 10:19, 28 through 29. It is therefore evident that Tyrus was a quote, strong city anterior to 1444 BC, which was the time of Joshua and the conquest of the quote, land of promise, unquote. We have therefore, and in reference to an event previous to Joshua, placed the foundation of Tyrus as early as 1600 years BC. Some authors have remarked that Homer has not mentioned Tyrus, and as a consequence that city was not in existence at the period of the siege of Troy. Homer mentions both mother and quote, daughter, unquote, under one name, this Sidonians. It was a term applied by the ancients to both nations and to everything elegant in art until the Tyrians, by their superior skill, won their own and a distinctive appellation. Nor can Homer be charged with ignorance in joining the two names. He followed what appears from his own language to have been a received custom. This is also proved by Solomon's message to a subsequent king of Tyrus, and the Tyrians in their early days were flattered by being called Sidonians. Quote, for thou knowest that there is not among us, in other words, Israel any that can skill to hew timber like unto the Sidonians, unquote. 1 Kings, verse 6. Then to assert that Tyrus did not exist at or before the fall of Troy, because the epic poet does not mention it, or that it is not to be found recorded as a city, is to proclaim that which is not sanctioned by the consensuate voice of acknowledged history. We will briefly review this point. The Trojan War, consequent upon the rape of the Spartan queen, commenced in the year 1194 BC. Now, in the previous page, it is proved that Tyrus was a quote, strong city, unquote, 250 years before the siege of Troy, for Joshua speaks of it as one of the boundaries for the tribe of Asher, and this event was 1444 BC, and that upon the authority of Holy Writ. Again, had such skeptics in the antiquity of Tyrus given a moment's consideration to the Grecian fleet employed to convey Agamemnon and his troops to Troy, they would have found that the knowledge of navigation was first introduced at Sidon and was, as a practical science, established by the Tyrians, and from them the Greeks derived their nautical skill and knowledge. Homer intended both nations in the one term Sidonians, but Euripides is more defined, for his subject demanded it, and as it has reference to his history as being the first recorded event after the founding of Tyrus, it will be mentioned more in detail. 1493 BC, 49 years before the period in which Joshua divided the lands of Canaan, and Tyrian chief, in other words, a Canamus, left Tyrus and Sidon apparently with a colony and founded Thebes in Greece. He is known in classic history as Cadmus, and has the reputation of introducing into his new territory of Thebes the ciphers of his country, and from which were formed the letters of the ancient Grecian alphabet, the language in which Homer subsequently depicted the deeds of Greek and Trojans. That the Theban Cadmus was a Tyrian and not a Sidonian is established by Euripides, as also the worship of Apollo and the sacred virgins. The poet has made a singular local error, as will be seen in the second line about to be quoted. For though the Isles of Tyrus was inhabited in the time of Euripides, it was not at the period contemplated by his tragedy. It is true that the isle, previous to Alexander, was, quote, sea girt, unquote, but it is evidently intended by the poet to have reference to the island capital, and therefore an anachronism The following translation from the original Greek will prove Cadmus to have been a Tyrian. Virgin Chorus, bounding o'er the Tyrian flood from Phoenicia's sea-girt isle, colluded from Tyre its brightest grace, worthy of the god, I came to Agnor's high-born race, glorifying Cadmus in thy name. Phoenicia is my country, gave me birth, and nurtured me, till, captive by the spear, selected from the virgin train, the sons of Cadmus led me hither to Apollo, a hallowed offering. As yet, Castilia's silverware, these flowing tresses waits to lave, delicious stream where bathes the virgin train, serving at Apollo's fane. When Cadmus from the Tyrian strand, arriving, trod this destined land, in other words, Thebes, a dragon there in scales of gold around his fiery eyeballs rolled, by Mars assigned that humid shade to guard the green extended glade, and silver streaming tide him as with pious haste he came to draw the purifying stream. Dauntless the Tyrian chief repressed, dashed with a rock his sanguine quest, and crushed his scaly pride. Virgin queen, at whose command Cadmus crushed the dragon's crest. The Phoenician virgins. There can remain upon the mind of the reader, from the previous quotation, not a doubt that the celebrated Cadmus of classic history was of Tyrus, and consequently it is the first name to be found having reference to Tyrian history. The chief events only of that history will be enlarged upon in these pages, for our aim will be to obtain and delineate the vital spirit of the nation and its principle of action, that instruction may not be forgotten in the contemplation of history's wild romance, for her prerogative has ever been to prove that truth is more strange than fiction. 1444 BC. This date has peculiar importance from the fact that, from the words of Joshua, Tyrus was then, quote, the strong city, unquote, consequently having its walls and means of defense, and by Joshua's not attacking either Sidon or Tyrus, it is evident that they were not regarded as nations of Canaan, but a separate and independent people. It is also an important error from the fact that one of the tribes of Israel, Asher, were portioned to possess the land of Canaan that approached, quote, to the strong city Tyre, unquote. Thus were the Israelites in juxtaposition with the Tyrians, and consequently it is apparent that the custom of circumcision, optionally, must have been introduced into the Phoenician family at this time, for it is recorded in the Bible that the great covenant with Abraham was discontinued. I'm going to reread that. For it is recorded in the Bible that the great covenant with Abraham was discontinued by Moses during the period of 40 years while journeying through the wilderness, and that every warrior of Israel who had left Egypt with the lawgiver had ceased to exist. And thereupon Joshua, as the successor of Moses, was commanded to renew the covenant with the race of Israel born in the wilderness. This was accomplished in the year 1451 BC. Now, this was only 7 years before the tribe of Asher were located in the immediate vicinity of the Tyrians, viz. 1444 BC. The Egyptians received the above custom of the Israelites, while the latter people sojourned with the former, and consequently previous to their exodus from the nation of the Nile. By the Egyptians it was practiced in the same manner, excepting their priests, as by the Tyrians, viz. Optionally. The mummies established this fact. The facility of the Tyrians to receive this custom was not only given by their vicinity to a tribe of Israel, but from the apparent fact that they both spoke the same language. The original language of the descendants of Abraham was not lost while they were in bondage in Egypt, because the Egyptians spoke the same language as the Israelites. These novel and important points we shall endeavor to establish when reviewing the original languages of Phoenicia, Egypt, Israel, and the two aboriginal races in the Western Hemisphere, all of which languages will be found to be the same. And if this present history is correct, those languages must be radically identical. Startling as the above may appear to the classic or general reader, we trust that his opinion will not be formed until he has investigated the argument of the present writer upon the subject, and which will be found in the second volume. From the facility then afforded by neighborhood and the means of communication by speaking the same language, not only was the custom of circumcision introduced, but probably many others of a minor character. 1434 BC. The first war in which the Tyrians were engaged was with this very tribe of Asher, who by their juxtaposition began to encroach upon the Tyrians and probably upon their religious and national customs. In this first conflict by the Tyrians, they were completely victorious and drove the Israelites, represented by the tribe of Asher, from all the sea coast of Phoenicia. This event probably occurred about 10 years after the tribe of Asher became located upon the Tyrian borders. We have therefore placed the date at 1434 BC. Maltbrun states the fact, but gives no date or the causes that led to it. We have endeavored to look beyond the effect and reach the cause, for it will be remembered that the Tyrians had their quote strong city unquote on the mainland. The celebrated island was not yet occupied. Encroachment was therefore easily felt and as quickly resented, and like their ancestors, the Sidonians, they were resolved to live quote, quiet and secure. Unquote. There is an importance attached to this event as regards the history of Israel, and to it may be traced the cause why the great Hebrew family did not become navigators. For being driven from the seacoast by the jealous Tyrians, all means of practicing the art were at once bereft them, and it was a position they never recovered. All historians agree in according to the Phoenicians the honor of being the first navigators. Their locality being on the seacoast would naturally suggest to them the means of carrying on commercial intercourse with their colonies or neighbors, and they were the first of the human families so located after the deluge This is proved by the third descendant from Noah, viz., Sidon, founding the first seacoast capital. The Tyrians, as the immediate branch of the house of Sidon, may be believed to have practiced these science in its simple and elementary forms many years before Joshua's record that Tyrus was a quote strong city unquote, or the founding of Grecian Thebes by the Tyrian Cadmus, for that chief must have reached the dragon guarded shore by means of a galley. Euryphides supports this position. Quote, bounding o'er the Tyrian flood from Phoenicia's sea-girt isle, our oars brushed lightly o'er the iron brine along Cilicia's wave-washed strand. Unquote. The Tyrians were early renowned for their fisheries, and the produce from that toil became their chief object of export. This and all discoveries by voyages they guarded with a monopolizing and constant vigilance, and their peculiar characteristics may be traced to the coastwise and early maritime expeditions, for they were acknowledged by all nations to be the pilots and mariners of the ancient world. They had for many ages no rivals upon the waters of the Mediterranean, but when by degrees other nations were established upon the opposite shores or islands of the great inland sea, and availing themselves of the same means as the Tyrians to increase their power or wealth, then Tyrus, ever jealous of her original strength, instantly made war, or piratical crusades, or piratical crusades against those infant navies, and crushed them even in their cradled security. Thus, early in her history, did, quote, the daughter of Sidon, unquote, put forth her hand and power against every encroachment upon her supposed prerogative until she was acknowledged as, quote, queen of the sea, unquote. And when Neptune had placed the naval crown upon her brow, still so jealous was this ocean Juno of her high station that she would allow no courtiers or flatterers upon that element where she had resolved to reign supreme, nor could she fear any decision against her, for no shepherd of Ida existed to give at that time a marine preference to Athens or Cyprus. The Tyrian Juno admitted of no argument or comparison with her beauty, intellect, or authority. She therefore cast the golden apple beneath her imperious foot. It withered upon her shores, but the seeds of discord were scattered by envious winds to distant lands, and in after ages she found that her rivals in fame were firmly planted and thence enthroned at Carthage and Alexandria. The only city permitted by the Tyrians to practice navigation was Sidon, and that permission was founded upon the remembrance of their motherland and not for the purpose of promoting or encouraging the science. The same courtesy founded upon blood relationship was extended at a later period to Carthage, a colony from Tyrus. From these family considerations were created the ever-existing friendship between the Sidonians, Tyrians, and Carthaginians. For about 5 centuries and a half, Tyrus was governed by chiefs of the people, each succeeding Cadmus having the civil, military, and naval power not granted to him as to a dictator, but aided by a council, somewhat similar to the judge and Sanhedrin of Israel. The same causes may have led the people of Tyrus to demand a king as the Israelites, and they may have used the same argument. Not only that, but the Tyrians may have received the idea itself of a monarchy from their neighbors of Israel, who obtained it only 39 years before the Tyrians. There seems to be such a singular connection in regard to the periods of the commencement of the first monarchies of Israel and Tyrus. For, by tracing the causes of the former, a conclusion may be arrived at for the latter. The following quotations will be found in the first book of Samuel, chapter 8. Quote, "And it came to pass that when Samuel was old, that he made his sons judges over Israel. And his sons Joel and Abiah walked not in his ways, but turned aside after lucre, and took bribes, and perverted judgment. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel unto Ramah, and said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations." Unquote. Samuel's celebrated remonstrance against the institution of an unlimited monarchy was useless. Quote, "Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, Nay, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us, and go out before us, and fight our battles." Unquote. Saul was consequently anointed the first king of Israel. This was in 1095 BC. Such an event could not pass unnoticed by the Tyrians. Israel had passed from the flowing robes of a chief judge to the gorgeous mantle and crown of sovereignty. The Tyrians had already received some of the customs of the Hebrews, that especially of circumcision, and they may have felt that monarchy was becoming in the scale of nations as a test of a people's power, and it would naturally lead them to exclaim, quote, "Let us be governed like all the nations." Unquote. Whatever the arguments of the Tyrians for a king, certain it is that in a few years, 39, after the election of the first monarch in Israel, the Tyrians threw off the Cadmean government and elected their first king in the person, 1056 BC, Ababal, who, according to Menander of Ephesus and Dias and Phoenicia, commenced his reign in the year 1056 BC. This record is sanctioned by the Jewish historian Josephus, who is supported by the Theophilus Antiochus. An additional impulse would naturally be given to the Tyrians in regard to a monarchy from the fact that in this very year the first king of Israel, being defeated in the battle of Gilboa, committed suicide, and David, who was already in renown, was chosen to the sovereignty of the house of Judah, not over all Israel, that followed 8 years after. Therefore, the second Hebrew king and the first Tyrian monarch ascended their respective thrones in the same year, 1056 BC. and between whom there commenced and continued a lasting friendship. It would therefore seem that the ancient victory obtained by the Tyrians in driving from the sea coast the tribe of Asher had been acknowledged to the victors without any resentment from the united tribes of Israel, as the conflict on the part of the Tyrians was founded in justice after encroachment, the descendants of Abraham. Feeling keenly the bondage they experienced in Egypt, could estimate and appreciate a victory gained upon the very ground of argument which they themselves had resolved to resent, conquer, or die. Ababal reigned apparently with satisfaction to his subjects, as he did not die a violent death, and the hereditary succession to the throne was established by the people in the reception of his son, Hiram, who became the most celebrated of the Tyrian monarchs. Ababal reigned 10 years and died in the year 1046 BC, and from scripture seems to have borne the surname of Hiram, in other words, Hiram, which has led some authors to style his son and successor Hiram II. The following, however, is an extract from the letter written by the son of Ababal to Solomon after the death of the first king of Tyrus, wherein the father's name is distinctly stated to be Hiram. The letter has reference to the temple. Quote, "And now I have sent a cunning man endued with understanding of Hiram my father's," unquote. The Phoenician writer Dias and others styled the first king Ababal without any surname. If it had been born, it is likely that it would have been mentioned. It appears, therefore, evident that the national name of the first king was Ababal. Only Hiram, in other words, Hiram, was perhaps the family name and assumed by the second monarch in resemblance of that fact and in affection to his parent. And that will conclude the reading of Book 2, Chapters 1 and Chapter 2. I thank you so much for joining me. Now, on closing, be mindful of misinformation and especially the attempt at eliminating all information and history regarding the atrocities of people of color and their forefathers. Don't forget to check out my videos about the Catoctin Iron Furnace burial remains. Set your notifications so that you can tune in to the next scheduled live of Chapter 2 here at the My History Verified YouTube channel. Thanks for joining. Please subscribe and share the At My History Verified